guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is George Walsh. He's a U.S. Navy veteran of World War II, in which he served as a dive bomber pilot. He is now a leading historian on the dive bombers as well. And George, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start at the beginning of your story. Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, during the Depression years. I had never left Brooklyn in growing up. I even went to Brooklyn College. And as World War II was approaching, I could see it was coming. I had two cousins who had been in the trenches in World War I, and I decided that I wanted to be part of the trenches and that type of warfare. So I enlisted in the Navy, not enlisted, but I applied to the Navy for the cadet program. That was before the draft in 1940, 41, before the 40, I guess. And they agreed to let me finish college. And as soon as Pearl Harbor came, they called me in. I went to flight training in New Orleans for 3 months, and then over to Pensacola. I got my wings at the end of 1942, and got my first assignment. You know where they sent me?
Where?
Floyd Bennett Field in Brooklyn on anti-submarine patrol.
Well, all right, let's walk through a couple different pieces of that story. How did you hear about the Naval Aviation Cadet Program?
I was so interested in exploring the various services that I might apply to that I landed on naval aviation as being the cleanest and most attractive to me. I didn't want to get involved in the war and then become a casualty. I figured I'd join something where it would be all or nothing. And aviation appealed to me, and I preferred naval aviation over the Army. So I went directly to 24 Church Street in New York and put in my application.
When you joined the program, did you have a feeling that you would be going to war soon?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I knew it was coming. Pearl Harbor was no surprise to me.
What was your reaction when that happened? Where were you?
I don't know where I was, except that it was just a matter of routine to me. I fully expected it to happen because of the tension that kept building and the embargoes on Japan. They had no alternative but to attack us.
Then once Pearl Harbor was attacked, that's when you were sent to where?
Well, there was a couple of months. It was March 1942 that I went to New Orleans.
Okay. Talk about the training that you had at New Orleans.
Do you want a personal story?
Sure.
I had had appendicitis attack previously. And just before I was due to go in the Navy, I had an appendicitis attack, and the doctor wanted to operate and would not be responsible for life if I didn't have the appendicitis removed. I said, no, I'm going to the Navy next week, put some ice on it. And which they did, and it subsided. I went down to New Orleans. I was only in New Orleans for a couple of weeks when the appendicitis popped up, and my first flight with the Navy was a Yellow Peril, a Stearman, flying me from New Orleans to the hospital at Pensacola, where I had my appendix out. And then I came back to New Orleans, rather. I came back to New Orleans, and I wanted to stay with my class. So I did, despite my weakened condition from the operation.
And then once you got in the sky, had you ever flown a plane before?
No, I'd never flown a plane before. I'd never even been in an airplane, and I did not know how to drive a car. I learned to fly an airplane before I learned to drive a car.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Was it something that came naturally to you?
Yeah. I went through flight training without a down check, and I think partially that might be because I was handling controls for the first time. I was not an automobile driver. Changing over to an airplane. I was approaching the airplane fresh and took to it right away. It had no problem.
So then you went to Brooklyn.
I went to Floyd Bennett Field, and I spent a year trying to get out of Brooklyn. I kept applying to the captain for fleet duty, until they finally gave in and sent out to Washington. I was given the opportunity to say what branch of the Navy I wanted to fly with, the fighters, the bombers, or torpedo planes, and I decided on the dive bombers. Went to Wildwood, joined up with a group of younger pilots who were right out of operational training in Florida and had operational training in dive bombers, where I was coming from Floyd Bennett Field, where I was flying OS-2U float planes and on wheels. And I learned to dive bomb simply by following what the other guys did. And most of the pilots who came from anti-submarine patrol and OS-2Us got washed out pretty quickly, but there were two of us, Doc Law and myself, who stayed on with the squadron. And after we finished training in Wildwood, we then joined up and had the group organization. The torpedo planes came down from Quonset, the fighter planes from Atlantic City, and the dive bombers from Wildwood. And we joined up in Oceana and began training as a group.
What appealed to you about the dive bombers? Why did you choose that?
I'm not sure now, looking back, but I think originally I chose to become the scout bomber. And I sort of had the image of the old Indian scouts in the Old West who used to go out and scout for the Indians before the main army, and I liked the idea of being a loner and being out there and being a scout. So I became a scout bomber. Well, the scout bombers were dive bombers. So that's how I happened. I sort of fell into dive bombing because I wanted to be a scout bomber.
Is that something that you think, it's obviously different from regular bombing, is it harder?
Dive bombing is one of the least understood weapons that's ever existed. Even to this day, they still show dive bombers coming in like this and dropping bombs and flying away. It wasn't like that at all. We came in 2 miles high and dove straight down. You were in the plane, looking down, hanging from your shoulder straps in the plane, looking at the planes ahead of you in their dive, seeing their bombs hit, as you concentrated on the target yourself and pulled out. The 70-degree dive that they describe is because once you're in a vertical dive, you still have lift on the wings. So the plane goes like this at a 70-degree angle. So you do have to account for that in your dive, that there is some lead of the target because of your motion sideways. But as far as the attitude of the plane in the dive, it was vertical, not this, like this.
Not an angle, it's an actual dive.
Yeah. We dove down, in the Battle of Midway, the pilots would drop at about 2,500 feet, although Dusty Kleiss says that when he hit the cargo, he went as low as 1,500 feet. That was because in peacetime training, they considered it a problem of being caught in the explosion of the planes ahead of them, or even an explosion of your own bomb. So you pulled out 2,500 feet, but in my time, we were diving on smaller targets, which are much more harder to hit, and you had to go lower if you're going to be accurate. So we went down as far as 1,000 feet before we pulled out. Now, 1,000 feet, you're going at 500 feet a second. That means that the dive bomber had only 2 seconds before impact. The only difference between our dive bomber and the kamikaze, that we pulled out that 2 seconds before impact, whereas the dive bomber, whereas the kamikaze continued right on until impact. The only difference between us and the Tomahawk missile, we were the first guided missiles, except we were guided by pilots who pulled out the last 2 seconds and the tomahawk basically went straight in. There was a Japanese film that was a simulation, computer graphics, where the Japanese showed the vertical dive bombing of the Midway Plains. The Japanese film was about the Battle of Midway, and it showed the dive bombers coming in vertically.
Now, could you release your bombs while you were in the dive, or did you have to flatten out first?
No, you released your bomb in the dive. The plane was equipped with a yoke, and the yoke swung out. So when you hit the bomb release, the yoke swung out, and the bomb dropped so that it cleared the propeller. Mm-hmm. The yoke enabled the bomb to clear the propeller in the dive because the bomb fell free, and without any resistance, it fell faster than the airplane. And that meant that it had great impact. By the time it hit the target, that bomb had a lot of impact from the dive bomber itself. And then after the plane released the bomb, it picked up additional acceleration, and it hit with the target with tremendous impact.
Phenomenal. Sir, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back on Veterans Chronicles with World War II U.S. Navy veteran George Walsh. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Corombos, joined today, right now, by World War II and U.S. Navy veteran George Walsh. He is a dive bomber pilot and one of the great historians of the dive bombing pilots. And, sir, it's great to have you with us. We have basically led up in your story to the point where you entered combat. When did that happen?
We took the Ticonderoga from its launching through a shakedown in 1944 and went out to Pearl Harbor, and our first combat missions were in November of 1944, just after the MacArthur landings on Leyte. So our first missions were to support MacArthur and the landings at Leyte. And that entailed, in our first missions, the bombing of Manila, and the harbor of Manila, and the ships that were moored there. I received a DFC for one of those missions. That was on the morning, I think, of November 14th, 1944. When we came in from sea, we were about 100 miles off the Philippines. We flew in over the mountains of eastern Philippines, which were about 14,000 feet high, across the farmlands till we came to the city of Manila and the harbor beyond. And I was the leader of the second section, led by the division was led by Paul Callett. And when we approached the city, it was overcast, and it didn't look as if we'd be able to do any dive bombing. So Paul took his first three planes and went off to the left and began letting down to get under the undercast so he could drop his bombs from level flight rather than dive bombing. As I was above watching him go down, I looked over to the west and I saw a hole in the clouds, like a donut hole. So I decided that maybe you could dive bomb through that. So I pulled out and continued west over the bay, and this donut hole ahead of me began to fill up with anti-aircraft fire as the Japanese could hear the planes coming. They were ranging in on that particular spot. We flew right over there and dove right through the donut hole, straight down, and down below us, like a bullseye, was a Japanese cruiser, the Kiso. I dove on the Kiso and scored a hit reported by my gunner, and the two other pilots following me, we got another hit, and the Kiso was left burning and sinking. So that was the mission on which I got my DFC. There were many, many missions after that. One was when we were due to retire to Leyte for rest and recreation. Halsey got word that the Japanese were reinforcing Leyte. and the fleet turned around and went in at high speed towards Leyte. We took off at dawn. Actually, dark when we rose up. We rendezvoused by the tail lights on the planes and flew west over Leyte to Ormac Bay. And at Ormac Bay, we found the Japanese reinforcements, 15,000 troops and 5 destroyers. Not only the Ticonderoga planes, but 2 other carriers were there. So this massive dive bombers and torpedo planes came in and attacked that convoy and just wiped it out. Those reinforcements never got ashore to oppose MacArthur's troops. We also participated in the invasion of Iwo Jima. At Iwo Jima, I flew over the island the day before the invasion at 200 feet, looking for something to drop my bombs on. You couldn't see anything but pockmarked land. There were no signs of life at all. The controller finally told me to drop it on a map coordinates of K9. So I just unloaded everything I had on K9. I don't know whether it hit anything or not. On the morning of the invasion, I had a movie cameraman in my back seat, and the movie cameraman was filming the landings. The pictures you see of Iwo Jima and Mount Suribachi, you probably take it from my plane. And we flew back and forth and watched the invasion. It looked like a piece of work because they hit the beach right on time. And it wasn't until the next day that we found out what a terrible beating the Marines had taken on that landing. We didn't cover the landings at Iwo Jima, but we raided Iwo Jima before the landings. When the Ticonderoga came out of the China Sea, Halsey took the China Sea in to support MacArthur again when he was landing on Luzon, the northern shores of Luzon. Weather in the China Sea was terrible. Low overcast. We flew in terrible weather, 400-foot ceilings and mist and rain. It was really bad. We felt lucky when we went out through the straits back into the Pacific. But we were in the Pacific on January 21st, 45, when having come from the China Sea, when we were caught by the kamikaze planes, and our ship took 2 hits by kamikaze. The first, on the mission in the morning, my plane had been shot up, and I had no tail hook when I got back to the carrier, so they had me wait and land after everybody else had landed. So I was the last plane to land on the Ticonderoga without a tail hook. It took a barrier crash, and nobody was hurt. It went off well, and I was congratulating myself when I got down in the ready room, just about to take off my flight suit, when this kamikaze went through the deck 20 feet from our light deck. All of us in the ready room were trapped. We went to the front door, there was smoke and flames. And we went to the rear door, the outboard door, smoke and flames. We milled around in there in the smoke and flames. Georgie Senna sat down on the ready room chair and said, "Well, I guess this is it." And then a voice came down on the squawk box that said, "Go aft on the port side." I was near the inboard exit, so I opened the door, and there was smoke but no flame. I stepped out onto the thing and started walking along the galley towards the rear. And in the smoke, I couldn't see anything, but I just sort of felt my way along. And then just a point midway going aft, this galley opens up onto the hangar deck. You could look out. You just have your footing and a railing to hang on to as you go across. I got there and didn't know whether there was anything left of the galley. And I stopped. I could feel myself stepping forward and pitching down onto the hangar deck. Of course, there was no longer a galley there. But the group behind me kept pushing, so they pushed me out anyway. And I was forced to go ahead until I got to a fire door, which I opened, and we got out. I went up inboard to the flight deck, got in a SB-2C and began inhaling oxygen. And then I sort of blacked out. I don't know what happened, but from being up forward in the cockpit of a sudden SB-2C, the next thing I remember, I was aft, standing on the flight deck, watching the second kamikaze come in, 50 feet over the battleship Missouri, through a hail of anti-aircraft fire. This guy just came right in and smashed into the bridge of the Ticonderoga. We lost a lot of guys. We had 24 dive bomber pilots in the squadron at that time. One was killed and 5 were seriously injured, so that they couldn't fly anymore, including the captain and the exec. Both Annapolis men, by the way, which left the squadron without Annapolis leadership. It was not the same squadron after that. The Ticonderoga was sent back to the U.S. to Bremerton to be repaired, and our squadron was transferred to the Hancock.
Sir, let's pause.
So we were aboard the Hancock when the Iwo Jima invasion occurred.
Sir, we'll pick up your story in just a moment. We'll be right back on Veterans Chronicles. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles on the Radio America Network. Honored to be speaking with Mr. George Walsh, a U.S. Navy veteran, a dive bomber pilot in World War II, and a great historian on dive bombing as well, which we'll talk about here in the next few minutes. Sir, just before the break, you talked about joining the Hancock as a result of the damage to the Ticonderoga. How was it different on the Hancock as opposed to the Ticonderoga?
Dixie Kiefer was the captain of the Ticonderoga, and he was a regular guy, a favorite of the pilots. But the skipper of the Hancock was different, much sterner. Dixie allowed all of the pilots to have a case of liquor aboard, which we could draw upon any time we wanted. No, it wasn't abused. It was really good.
That helped with the nerves?
When we got to the Hancock, the first thing the captain did was line us up and throw all the booze overboard. It was a different ship. It was not a happy ship. We were not the same because, in a way, we were kind of shaken up a bit by what had happened. And we had the leadership of a V-7 guy who had served on a destroyer, who did not have as much flight time as most of us in the squadron, but because of his time on the destroyer, he had the rank. And he took over as skipper of the squadron. And he was not a leader in the sense that the Annapolis men were. So that was a disappointment. That was the difference that we found aboard the Hancock, to answer your question.
I want to talk a little bit more about dive bombing in general now. From what I've read, you have said that the dive bombers really made the difference at Midway because the Japanese had the equipment advantage in terms of ships, in terms of the fighter planes, but the dive bombers were the things that really made the difference. Explain how.
Halsey made tests of the torpedo bombers before Pearl Harbor, before the Battle of Midway, rather, early in June of 1942, and he agreed that the torpedoes were useless. They had set up tests in the early flights in the Gilberts and Marshall Islands, where they had a group of Japanese merchant ships trapped in a harbor. They sent in the torpedo planes to sink them, and each torpedo plane had a dive bomber as an escort to track what happened. And they reported that none of the bombs sank, none of the bombs hit and exploded on the ships. They ran erratically, they ran deep, and some of them just hit the hull of the ships that they were targeting, and the torpedoes broke up and sank without exploding. So Halsey knew that the torpedo planes were useless. And his plan for the Battle of Midway was that he would not use the torpedo planes, but he would launch, at the first sighting of the Japanese, he would launch all of the dive bombers in a surprise attack. without escort by the torpedo planes or the fighters. He eliminated the fighters because he felt that they were more valuable defending our carriers against a possible Japanese attack, and they didn't have the range to be able to go with the dive bombers and stay with them through the attack and then a search if necessary. Admiral Fletcher did not follow that plan in the Battle of Midway. He and Spruance decided to do the full attempt at the coordinated attack with dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. But actually, Halsey did not have his heart in the battle. After he had lost the Lexington and Coral Sea and had the Yorktown damaged, he was kind of on the defensive. Instead of holding the ambush station 200 miles north of Midway, Fletcher put a little more distance between the Japanese and his ships, and he flew searches which took our fleet east out of the ambush station 200 miles north of Midway, and at extreme range for our planes, so that all of the confusion that happened at the Battle of Midway, like the Hornet group, for instance, that not one of the Hornet fighters or dive bombers found the Japanese fleet. The torpedo planes did with John Walden, and he attacked, which he shouldn't have done because it was against fleet doctrine to make an unsupported torpedo attack. And all of his torpedo planes were shot down except George Gay, who wrote a book about it, The Sole Survivor. The Enterprise and the Hornet each had traveled 240 degrees in search of the Japanese fleet. Commander Ring, who was commanding the Hornet group, reached the point where they expected to find the Japanese, and they weren't there anymore. Too much time had passed, and the Japanese had turned course and were headed northeast. So the Hornet missed the rendezvous and the target, and Ring turned left, closing on Midway, and of course he missed the Japanese fleet. Wade McCluskey, who commanded the Enterprise dive bombers, turned right at that time, and he found the Japanese carriers, and he took his men in and was able to sink the Kaga and the Akagi. At the same time, although they launched much later, the Yorktown planes arrived, and they sank the Siriu. There was only 12 of them because Fletcher had held half of his dive bombers back for defensive purposes, and they had only 6 fighters to escort them. But that meant that we had destroyed 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers that morning. Then in the afternoon, they were able to put together from the planes that had survived 24 planes to attack the Hiryu, and those 24 planes from the Enterprise and the Yorktown, from the Enterprise rather, yeah, and they were Yorktown planes, but they were flying from the Enterprise, I guess, and they sank the Hiryu, despite the fact that they were intercepted by Japanese fighters at high altitude and harassed by the Jap fighters all the way down in their dives. They only lost 3 planes. In the morning, McCluskey group lost half of their planes. They had 33, they lost 17. Nobody knows how many were lost by Japanese fire and how many were simply lost because they were down at sea for lack of fuel.
When you make a dive bombing run, do you drop everything in one run, or do you circle back around?
No, we dropped everything in one run. On an occasion like that, that's what they would do.
Okay.
There was circumstances later on, which are minor, where you're doing Japanese airfields where we sometimes made 2 separate attacks. In 1989, we had a reunion of our squadron in Chicago, and I began to wonder in talking to the group why there was never a book written about the dive bombers. There was never a book, there was never a film, there was never a TV documentary. All of the films that we had shot in combat just simply disappeared. They never surfaced. The TV programs on the TV channels covered every weapon and since the dawn of time, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, the English bowmen, and then all the armaments in World War I, the tanks, the fighter planes, and then in World War II, the strategic bombing. There were plenty of films about World War II, but never one devoted to the dive bombers. I began to wonder why. And I began researching the Battle of Midway. And each time I did, I peeled away more and more evidence that the Navy had suppressed the true story of the Battle of Midway, and that they are still doing it. The worst was in the mid-50s, 1955, when you had Crusade in the Pacific and Victory at Sea. Those 2 major documentaries told about the Battle of Midway, and they showed all 4 of the Japanese carriers being sunk by torpedoes. That was not true, and they must have known that that was not true. Now that continued on until Walter Lord's book came out about 1967, and he interviewed 400 veterans of the Battle of Midway, and he pieced together a better story of what really happened. But there was no help to him from the National Archives. I was never able to get anything out of the National Archives or the Naval History or Heritage Command. I felt that I was being stonewalled for many, many years, particularly in 2014 when I spent 7 months trying to get some copies of letters written by Admiral King, Nimitz, and Fletcher just before Pearl Harbor, just before the Battle of Midway. It continues on to this day. I still feel that there's an awful lot about the Battle of Midway that remains to be told. Whether it's going to be told by a examination of the events, of things that really happened, or whether papers are going to turn up memoirs of people who had participated in the battle, or whether a new generation comes along and they open up completely the archives so that the true story of what actually happened can be divulged. To this day, nobody has said who actually authorized the Battle of Midway. We had no torpedoes. Our fleet had been in the South Pacific for 6 months in war conditions. They had gone through the Battle of the Coral Sea. They were war-weary in May of 1942. And Admiral Nimitz was given 3 weeks to pull together that fleet from the South Pacific and the Coral Sea, war-weary, without torpedoes. They all needed replenishment. The air groups needed replacement pilots and planes for those that had been lost. And in 3 weeks, he was able to send that fleet to sea again to face a completely undefeated and powerful Japanese fleet. Were we risking our carriers for the 2 little sand spits in the middle of the ocean? We gave up Guam, we gave up Wake Island without a fight. I'm sure that Nimitz and Spruance would be willing to give up those sand spits in the middle of the ocean rather than risk their 3 carriers. But at that time, the Japanese were so powerful and they had accomplished so much in moving southward from Japan into the South Pacific and the Indian Oceans that Churchill was in trouble. There was a danger of having the British fleet was driven out of the Indian Ocean in April of 1942 by the Japanese, and they had an opportunity to blockade the Indian Ocean. And Churchill he called it after the war the most desperate hours of the war when they faced defeat. The war was in balance. Victory was in balance at that time. And all we had in the way of an offensive weapon was the dive bombers in the air and the Marines on the ground. Churchill appealed to Roosevelt for help. And I believe that one of the things that Roosevelt did to help Great Britain was to risk our 3 carriers. If we had lost those 3 carriers, we would have been in terrible shape because the U.S. would have been forced back to the West Coast. And we wouldn't have effective torpedoes until September 1943, and we would have the new Essex-class carriers being launched, and we would again become a factor. Before that time, however, the Japanese could have turned on their traditional enemy, the Russians, and between the Germans and the Japanese, they could have defeated the British at El Alamein and the Russians at Stalingrad, and the war could have gone completely against the British, particularly. So they would have had to sue for peace before the year and a half could go out, that we could be of help to them.
Right. So the consequences of Midway go much, much deeper than just the momentum.
The consequences of Midway were not just in the Pacific. They affected the outcome of the war in North Africa, in Russia, in China through the Burma Road. Lend-Lease would have been cut off. Lend-Lease that was supporting the British at Suez, supporting the Russians at Stalingrad, supporting the Chinese through the Burma Road. That all would have been cut out. And the Germans and the Japanese would have had a year and a half when they would have been free to attack the Russians. The Japanese could take their Manchurian troops and turn them loose to create a second front on the Russians. No wonder Churchill called it the most desperate moment of the war.
Sir,
there's so much of it that hasn't really been told yet that I urge future historians to, for one thing, read my blogs where I outline a lot of what I'm saying here. I have 10 blogs up and running all about the Battle of Midway. I am on YouTube. I have a book. The YouTube has a very good layout of the whole thing. It's a speech that I made at the Taylor Convention in Reno in 2011. But you've got to be interested in the Battle of Midway to look at something like that because it runs for 43 minutes. We need a new movie about the Battle of Midway.
Well, and hopefully this one will talk about the critical role the dive bombers played. Sir, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your service to our country, and thank you for your efforts to bring the truth to light about a pivotal aspect of that pivotal battle.
Thank you.
George Walsh is a veteran of the U.S. Navy, a dive bomber pilot. He is a veteran of World War II. I'm Greg Corombos. This is Veterans Chronicles. Hi, this is Greg Corombos, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features. And of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.